I wanted to share a book excerpt with you from Noam Chomsky's Understanding Power. It's a question and answer format, and this particular section is about the NAFTA and GATT treaties and how they became legislation through Congress. So the question is, you mentioned that people with power probably don't like it that the GATT treaty got out onto the internet. It just emphasized for me how these international trade agreements are being forced on us, and yet nobody even knows what they're about. I'm wondering what you think of that. And Chomsky's response: well, plenty of people know what they're about. There are plenty of people working for big corporations who know that what the GATT treaty is about, for example. But you're right. The general population here doesn't have the slightest idea about it. I mean, overwhelmingly, the general population of the United States hasn't even heard of GATT, and certainly doesn't know what its likely effects are going to be. GATT, or the General Agreement on Trade Tariffs, was first established in 1947, but the Uruguay round of negotiations to modify it concluded in December 1993. Then the treaty was signed in April 1994. What do I think of that? I think it's ridiculous, grotesque in fact. Look, GATT is something of major significance. The idea that it's going to be rammed through Congress on a fast track without public discussion just shows that anything resembling democracy in the United States has completely collapsed. So whatever one thinks about GATT, at least it should be a topic for the general population to become informed about, and to investigate, and to look at, and think about carefully. That much is easy. If you ask what should happen in that public discussion, well, if that public discussion ever comes along, I'll be glad to say what I think. And what I think is in fact mixed. It's like NAFTA. I don't know of anyone who was opposed to a North American trade agreement in principle. The question was, what kind? So before NAFTA got passed in 1993, mainstream groups like the Congressional Office of Technology Assessment, can't get more centrist than that, came out with a very sharp and intelligent critiques of the executive version of NAFTA, the one that finally went through. And they pointed out that in fact NAFTA was designed to be an investor rights agreement, not a free trade agreement, and that it was going to drive the economies of each of the three participating countries, the US, Canada, and Mexico, down towards some kind of low-wage, low-growth equilibrium. They didn't say, of course, but it'll also be a high-profit equilibrium, and they suggested very constructive alternatives. Well, these sorts of constructive critiques never even entered mainstream discussion about NAFTA. Here, all you ever heard in the media was crazy jingoists don't like Mexican farm workers. The same was true of the American labor movement. Its proposals were nothing like that, what was constantly being denounced in the press with virtually 100% uniformity. The Labor Advisory Committee, for example, which by law is required to give its opinion on these things, but was illegally cut out of the discussion, came out with a quite constructive report on NAFTA. It wasn't against an agreement, it was against that agreement. In fact, the story of the Labor Advisory Committee report tells you a lot about the way that NAFTA was passed in the US, a lot about American democracy. 20 years ago, Congress enacted a Trade Act requiring that before any trade-related legislation or treaty is passed, there has to be a consultation with a Labor Advisory Committee they set up, which was based on the unions such as they are. That's by law. The Labor Advisory Committee has to give an analysis and a critique of any American trade-related issue, so obviously that would include NAFTA. Well, the Labor Advisory Committee was informed by the Clinton White House that their report was due on September 9th. They were not even given an inkling of what was in the treaty until September 8th. So obviously they couldn't even convene to meet. Then on top of that, they weren't even given the whole text of the treaty. It's this huge treaty, hundreds and hundreds of pages. But somehow, they did manage to write a response to it anyway, and it was a very angry response, both because of the utter contempt for democracy revealed by these maneuvers, but also because from the glimmerings that they could get out of NAFTA, when they sort of flipped through it for a couple hours, it was obvious that this thing was just going to have a devastating effect on American labor, and probably also a devastating effect on Mexican labor too. Though of course it will be highly beneficial to American investors and probably also to Mexican investors. It's also certainly to have a highly destructive effect on the environment because its laws supersede federal and state legislation. So obviously there are really major issues here, crucially important issues, which in a functioning democracy would have been the subject of intensive public consideration and debate. Actually, if you looked closely, even NAFTA's advocates conceded that it was probably going to harm the majority of the populations of the three countries. For instance, its advocates in the United States were saying, it's really good, it'll only harm semi-skilled workers. Footnote, 70% of the workforce. As a matter of fact, after NAFTA was safely passed, the New York Times did their first analysis of its predicted effects in the New York region. It was a very upbeat article talking about how terrific it was going to be for corporate lawyers and PR firms and so on. And then there was a footnote there as well. It said, well, everyone can't gain. There'll also be some losers. Women, blacks, Hispanics, and semi-skilled labor. In other words, most of the people of New York. But you can't have everything, and those were the advocates. In fact, it's kind of striking that about a day or two after NAFTA was passed, the Senate approved the most onerous crime bill in U.S. history, the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, which the House then made even worse. Now, I don't know if that was just a symbolic coincidence or what, but it makes sense. I mean, NAFTA was clearly going to have the effect of reducing wages for probably 3/4 of the American population, and it's going to make a lot more of the population superfluous from the point of view of profits. So the crime bill just will take care of a lot of them by throwing them in jail. Okay, that's NAFTA. What about GATT? Well, in India, for example, there were hundreds of thousands of people demonstrating about some of the GATT's provisions, which they know about. I mean, we may be very ignorant about it in the United States, but people in the third world know a lot about GATT. Indian peasants understand what's being done to them, even if people here don't, which is why GATT has to be passed virtually at gunpoint in countries like India. Well, what are these people so upset about? Here's one thing. One of the protections codified in the current GATT agreements, as in NAFTA, is what's called intellectual property rights, i.e. rights to registered trademarks, patented technologies, and copyrights of valuable information, products ranging from music to jeans. Intellectual property rights are a protectionist measure. They have nothing to do with free trade. In fact, they're the exact opposite of free trade. And they'll do a lot of things, but two really crucial ones. First of all, they're going to increase the duration of patents, meaning if Merck Pharmaceutical patents some drug, thanks to publicly subsidized work in American universities, for example, now they can get a much longer patent for it under GATT, much longer than any of the rich countries ever accepted during periods when they were developing. Incidentally, in fact, it's only in very recent years that the rich countries have even honored patent rights at all. The United States never did when it was a developing country, for instance. So point one, patents are being much extended. Secondly, the nature of patents is being shifted in character. See, up until now, patents have been what are called process patents. In other words, if Merck figures out a way to create a drug, the process of making the drug is patented, but not the drug itself. The GATT treaty, like NAFTA, shifts that now it's the product that's patented, meaning the Indian or Argentine pharmaceutical industries no longer can try to figure out a smarter way to produce the same drug at half the cost in order to get it to their own populations more affordably. Notice that these are not only highly protectionist measures, but they are a blow against economic efficiency and technological progress. That just shows you how much free trade really is involved in all this. Actually, there are significant historical precedents on product patents, and I'm sure that they are perfectly well known to the GATT designers. France, for example, once had a chemical industry, but it lost most of it because it moved to Switzerland, which is why Switzerland has such a large chemical industry. The reason? France happened to have product patents, which were such a barrier to innovation and technological progress that the French chemical companies just decided to go elsewhere. Well, now GATT is trying to impose that inefficiency on the entire world. In fact, India already has been forced to accept it. A little while ago, they did what's called liberalizing their pharmaceuticals industry, meaning they opened it up to foreign penetration. So now drug prices will shoot sky high, more children will die, people won't be able to afford the medications they need, and so on. Well, these changes in patents are just one part of GATT. They're one piece of a whole attempt that's now being made to ensure that unaccountable transnational corporations will monopolize the technologies of the future. In my opinion, that's grotesque. I don't see any reason to push that through. Certainly, anyone who believes in free trade would be opposed to these policies. They are a high level of protectionism, which is specifically designed to be contrary to even the narrow definitions of economic efficiency they teach you in the University of Chicago Economics Department, home of well-known exponents of free market theory. GATT is going to cut down on technological innovation. It's going to cut down on economic efficiency. But by some strange accident, it will also happen to increase profits. So of course nobody will pick up on any of the contradictions. As a matter of fact, it's not even clear that these so-called free trade agreements are going to increase trade at all, in any authentic sense. So there's a lot of talk in the papers these days about the growth of international trade, which is supposed to show everyone how wonderful the market is. But if you take a look at that international trade, you'll find that it's a very curious kind of growth. About 50% of U.S. trade now is international to corporations, which means it's about as much trade as if you move something from one shelf of a grocery store to another. It just happens to cross an international border, so therefore it gets recorded as a trade, and the figures are comparable for many other major countries. That means, for example, that if the Ford Motor Company sends some parts to Mexico to be assembled by super cheap labor under essentially no environmental regulations, and then they ship it back to the United States to add more value to it, that's trade. But that's not trade at all. Those aren't exports. They didn't even enter the Mexican market. They're centrally managed interactions by huge institutions with a very visible hand pushing them around, and with all kinds of other market distortions involved that nobody here bothers to study very much, but which undoubtedly are severe. And 50% is not a small amount. That's a lot. I mean, at a time when that NAFTA was passed, there was a lot of talk in the press about U.S. trade with Mexico soaring. But there wasn't talk about the fact that more than half of U.S. exports to Mexico were internal to corporations. So in fact, NAFTA and GATT might really end up reducing trade. They'll probably increase things moving across borders, but that's not the same as trade. Those are just transfers, not market interactions. Well, okay, these are complicated matters, and you just don't want to sloganize about them. But in my opinion, all of these international agreements are part of a general attack on democracy and free markets that we're seeing in the contemporary period, as banks, investment firms, and transnational corporations develop new methods to extend their power free from public scrutiny. And in that context, it's not very surprising that they're all being rammed through as quickly and secretly as they are. And whatever you happen to think about the specific treaties that have now been put into place, there is just no doubt that their consequences for most people in the world are going to be vast. In fact, these treaties are just one more step in a process that's been accelerating in recent years of differentiating the two main class of interests the world's of the world still further, far more so than before, so that the third world wealth distribution model is being extended everywhere. And while the proportions of wealth in a rich country like the United States will always differ significantly from the proportions in a deeply impoverished country like Brazil, for example, you can certainly see the effects underway in recent years. I mean, in the United States, things probably aren't going to get to the point where 80% of the population is living like Central Africa and 10% is fabulously wealthy. Maybe it'll be like 50% and 30% or something like that, with the rest somewhere in between, because more people are always going to be needed in the Western societies for things like scientific research and skilled labor, providing propaganda services, being managers, things like that. But the changes no doubt are happening, and they will be rapidly accelerating as these accords are implemented.